Thank you so much for having me. So, yes, my name is Christopher Tounsel. Um, I am an African American, originally from the Chicagoland area. Um, and I am an assistant professor of history and African studies at Penn State University. My research throughout most of my career has concerned race and religion in modern Sudan. And my first book, which is entitled Chosen Peoples, Christianity and Political Imagination in South Sudan, was published last year by Duke University Press. And in that book, I really explore the ways in which people within South Sudan during the 20th and 21st centuries read Judeo Christian scriptures to really frame their revolutionary actions against the Sudanese state. Sudan, for much of its post colonial history, was kind of boggled down in two civil conflicts between the predominantly northern Sudanese Arab and Islamic population waging war against southern Sudanese Christians and non-Muslims who kind of identify culturally as being African. And so my research looked at the way in which, or the ways in which Southern Sudanese kind of read the Bible, right, as a kind of discursive, ideological tool, right, to help fuel their wars against Khartoum.
Thank you very much for that part. That is important. Now, my curiosity, is there anything that could have led you to study the history of Sudan in any particular way? Please help me with that.
Sure. So my curiosity about the relationship between religion and violence really goes back to the attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. I was a high school freshman at the time. And, immediately after the 9/11 attacks, then President George W. Bush famously framed North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as an axis of evil, right? And so the war on terror quickly became framed not just a, war against a political opponent, but really one that was framed with deeply spiritual and religious vocabulary. And so I became interested in kind of what the longer history was between, states deploying these, deeply spiritual terms within the context of kind of state-sponsored conflict. And so that kind of broader interest really landed me upon the Sudan in the late 19th century, which had the person who, at least within the Victorian English imaginary, was kind of like the Osama bin Laden of their world, the Sudanese Mahdi, who famously led a kind of Islamic revival against colonialism and was framed by the British as this kind of, evil, savage person who was, leading these Islamic hordes, right, in kind of deepest, darkest Africa, right? And so he was kind of like the kind of mediated Osama bin Laden circa the late 1800s. And so I started reading more and more about the Sudan, and I was just really intrigued, right, by Sudan serving as this context where you've got Arabs and Blacks and Christians and Muslims and colonialism and post-colonialism. And so it just seemed to be this geographic context that had so many things that I was interested in. And so by the time, I was in my young 20s, I was absolutely hooked. And so that's what I've been working on ever since.
That's very interesting. It's also very intriguing, as it were, in some part of it, though.
Yeah.
I want to believe that when people think of Sudan, they always think of maybe the Arabs, and that is probably what they know because that is what the mainstream is telling them. They don't ever imagine that there are pyramids in Sudan, no? Because when we talk of pyramids in Africa, we only remember, in fact, they don't even use the word Africa, as if Egypt is not in Africa. Egypt is somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So
Yeah.
they never know that Sudan is actually an integral part of the African history and the human evolution, as it were. So I'm really happy that someone is paying attention to that part of the African story.
To your point about the pyramids, one of the kind of, fun facts that I share with my students of early African history is that there are actually more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt, right? So to your point, yeah. So, but yeah, it's and it's I really try to impress upon my students that North Africa is Africa, right? There's this very long, historically rooted, you know, attempt that is in no small way, right, connected to the history of race and racism and slavery, right, that has attempted to frame North Africa as somehow not being true Africa, right? That Africa can only mean one thing, right? But I think that's another reason why the Sudan is so interesting because Sudan is kind of, you know, it's got one foot in both, right? It's this kind of crossroads between the Horn of Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. And so Sudan can be used to kind of, unsettle these very popular binaries.
The environment that you are truly on is very intriguing. Now, talking of the geography, I am living in Italy. We can say Italy is a European country, but it's also a Mediterranean country. It doesn't mean that it must be one, it cannot be the other, no? In the same way, they can say that Egypt is in the Middle East because that is how they define it, but it's also an Africa because that is also the African geography. So for the fact that we have a part that we call North Africa doesn't necessarily mean that it's different from Africa in terms of the culture that have evolved all these thousands of years. So of course, if it depends on how far we want to go in North Africa, there is a time that the Arab did it, were there.